This is the best dial I have ever seen on AliExpress for under $200, and here's why. So I was scrolling through AliExpress one day looking for strange things to waste my money on when a blurry picture of a really intriguing watch caught my eye. The watch in question is produced by a lesser known Chinese brand who name themselves Borman Engravers, which is admittedly a more pleasant name than Panis or Hrodland, however that's pronounced. Following this German-sounding aesthetic, Borman carries the slogan Genauigkeit Instrument, forgive me for absolutely butchering that, which in German directly translates to accuracy instruments on Google Translate, though according to a Reddit user, these two words printed on the dial are actually supposed to be connected, just another classic mistake by the Chinese trying to make their brand sound slightly European, though I must applaud their efforts since this does sound better than a number of the other brands on AliExpress. But in this classic case of bad translation, when you search up the name Borman, it actually brings up two results, and neither of them are the watch unfortunately, with one being a decorated NASA astronaut and Air Force colonel, and the other being a Nazi. Though I doubt that the manufacturers had any of this in mind, given that Borman seems to be a subsidiary of a brand with another European sounding name, Lobini Interlaken, Interlaken being a town in Switzerland. Besides that, if we take a closer look at the watch, we see an actually really well made fume-like sunburst dial with really clean looking applied hour markers both literally and figuratively. This in addition to a set of really well made hands and a strange choice to have what is essentially a painted knob as a seconds hand make this watch really stand out in the endless sea of extremely well priced watches on AliExpress. On top of that, add in the stunningly decorated uncommon movement and what is I think a CNC or lathe machined rotor, this watch really sticks out like a sore thumb, but in a good way. The watch coming in at a diameter of around 41.8mm excluding the crown and a thickness of just 11.7mm including the crystal is not your everyday common AliExpress watch, which might explain the heavy lack of popularity this brand has. See, most of the other brands on the site, Pagani Design, Cadison and even San Martin, make most of their profits from crafting decently made homages of really popular luxury watches like the Rolex Submariner or the Patek Philippe Nautilus. Well, in the case of Borman, they really seem to aim higher and make homages of the brands that only true collectors would buy. These brands in which the Borman is inspired by brands such as Moser and Arnold & Son, just to name a few, usually produce watches that are extremely complex or time-consuming to make. These brands challenge the idea of what a great watch should be, and unfortunately just don't get enough recognition in the watch world. And as a watchmaker and collector too, after noticing these unique details in the Borman Moonphase, I just couldn't pass it up. Many other brands on AliExpress tend to make use of cases produced by other brands, such as Pagani Design using the same cases for the Submariners as most of the other $100 NH35 Submariner homages on the market. Even more well-respected Chinese brands like Sugues falls prey to this, having seen the case for a few of their watches on watches from other brands, but in Borman's case, this just doesn't seem to be true, pun intended. Granted, they might have just bought a base template case and modified it since there is one single Kickstarter watch that shares the same case and movement, so take my words with a grain of salt. I mean, they do call themselves engravers after all, but from what I can see on my Borman Moonphase, it really shows that a large amount of effort was put into making the watch and almost every aspect of the watch was thought of. The case on this watch with its thin dimensions and 47.2mm lug-to-lug fits really well and is extremely comfortable on my wrist, especially when compared to the more vintage style cases made by brands like Sugues. This is most likely due to the design choice that Borman made for the lugs, where they extend slightly lower, making it fit better, whereas in some cases the lugs extend only slightly downward, making the caseback sort of poke into your wrist. And as we talk about the lugs, it's inevitable that I mention just how well the lugs are finished here. Not only do you get a slightly flat lug, which adds on to the aesthetic appeal of the watch, but you get a consistently and cleanly done chamfered edge on the side of the lug as well. The case also features an unusual concaved bezel, which warps the reflections of the surroundings, something that I feel matches really well with the Fume style brown dial. The case also features something really special. The case side features a very rarely seen finishing choice here that I feel plays really well with the watch they tried to create. The case side features an indented midsection that is sandblasted, in contrast with the polished edges in which it resides. I have only seen this style of case making on some high-end independent brands and on occasional grand complication releases by the major Swiss brands. However, despite the praise I have given to this, there is a small downside. The sandblasting on my watch is not done particularly evenly, with some parts of the matte textured section having major inconsistencies and worse scratches. There is also some etching on the other side of the case, closer to the crown, which states some specifications of the watch, and also automatic by Pink Venom. What's Pink Venom? It sounds like a 12-year-old Minecraft player's in-game name. But to be fair, on some other examples of the Borman Moonphase that I see in reviews, the problem that I have doesn't seem to exist. Besides that inner section of the case side, the whole case is genuinely manufactured extremely well. The case is polished cleanly and doesn't have areas in which light reflects inconsistently at all, which is pretty impressive when you consider the complexity of the design they chose. I'd also want to point out that the complex crown design they picked for this case remind me of the crown found on watches from the likes of Bergeon, and a visually pleasing crown like this very obviously requires much more effort to produce than just a standard onion-shaped one. And like the Caseback shares a similar level of uniqueness as well. The Caseback features a massive piece of what I assume to be mineral crystal after performing a water droplet test. This crystal displays the beautifully decorated Hangzhou 7M01 movement fitted with a stunningly engraved rotor. The Caseback also features an unusual screwing method, with a caseback shape similar to that made popular by the likes of Panerai. This means that popping the caseback off would require a tool specific to Panerai styled casebacks, similar to how Rolex has their jagged ones. The caseback also features a very pleasingly brushed circumference, which is honestly pretty refreshing, since so many other Chinese brands resort to etching brand and watch information that is sometimes untrue or irrelevant on the back of their watches. What makes it worse is that they always use that same bad font, just makes it look cheap to me. The watch comes with a black crocodile leather strap and is pretty much just your average generic genuine leather strap, nothing much else to say. The strap feels alright and is still quite comfortable to wear, and does also come with a quick release spring bar for easy strap changes. The butterfly clasp is also just your generic butterfly clasp, pretty similar to the one on most of my Sugas watches as a matter of fact. This clasp is engraved with the Borman logo and it's done pretty well. The engraving is actually quite deep, which in my opinion makes it look more luxurious, though I must say the thin font that they chose for the word Borman makes the clasp look a bit barren. With that said, we must start talking about how nice the dial is. The first impression I get from the dial is a clear and extremely obvious nod to the beautiful sunburst fume dials of Moser AC, or H Moser NCA like most people would pronounce it. I chose the brown as frankly I felt that I just had way too many blue watches already at this point, with my PRX and a couple of other blue dials that I've bought in the past. But despite my love and unending bias towards blue dials, I must say that Borman genuinely hit the color and shine jackpot with this brown colored fume dial. The dial features the classic Moser styled sunburst finishing throughout its entirety, resulting in the dial having a spray of at least 4 or more streams of light in most lighting conditions. This smooth sunburst really complements the black strap and the case of the watch. The hazel brown color chosen for this dial is also just the perfect match, bright enough to make the sunburst effect extremely prominent, yet dark enough that the sunburst effect is maximized, with color that ranges from a deep chocolate brown to a near golden brass color. This accompanied by the fume finishing on the dial, in which manufacturers would paint or stain the outer edge of the dial with increasing intensities, creates this absolutely stunning gradient from the center to the outer edge of the dial. Printed cleanly and very obviously on the dial is also the brand logo and slogan. In white it states Genauigkeit Instrument, Borman Engravers B/PV, which I don't particularly know the meaning of, so if you do know what this means, please tell me in the comments. The dial also proclaims the impressive 28,800 beat per hour beat rate of the watch, printed as a tiny marking right underneath the 6 o'clock position, which is actually quite a nice design choice, something commonly seen on much higher end watches. And once you've pulled yourself away from the mesmerizing shine of the fume dial, you begin to notice the truly mirror-polished, round hour markers set perfectly in the dial of the watch. But now you must be wondering what's so impressive about those. Well, first of all, I can virtually see no pieces of dirt or marks on the markers themselves. This may sound pretty rudimentary, but I rarely ever see something like this on watches around this price range, with some watches that I have had in the past, such as the Escapement Time King Seiko and the Pagani Design Root Beer, having very obvious fingerprints and dirt residues left on the hour markers themselves. What's worse is that some even come with microscopic scratches that you just don't catch without a loupe. But in the case of this Borman, all that is just inexistent, and I'm glad to say that the dial on this Borman Moonphase has the best quality control I have seen in a long time. And speaking of quality control, the hour markers on the dial are also all perfectly aligned, something that some watches around this price range occasionally fail at having. And on the subject of the dial, I must not forget to mention the Moonphase window they've implemented at 6 o'clock. This window features a really well done beveled edge, which I feel is a step above most other brands who wouldn't even bother. The window also shows off the really well finished Moonphase disc of the watch, which is a brushed metal disc with a section of it painted to act as a shadow over the moon. Might I also add that the brushed metal on this disc also gives it a dull sunburst effect that works perfectly with the dial. Complementing the dial is a set of really unique hands, a design that I've not yet seen on any other AliExpress timepiece. The handset on the Borman Moonphase features a thin spear-like hand with an addition of a gap in the midsection. The minute hand also features a slight bend on the end of it. The shape and overall look of the hands really just fit into the modern minimalist styling of the whole watch. The seconds hand, however, I don't really know what I feel about it. It's essentially just a small knob with a little black arrow printed on it. For one, I feel that they could have just done the seconds knob without the arrow, but I'm also glad that at least it's not that obvious on the watch itself. The movement in this watch is the pretty uncommon Hangzhou 7M01, Hangzhou being a well-respected movement manufacturer, producing movements that are on par with the likes of Seagull. From what I know, Hangzhou produces some really low-end movements, as well as some rather interesting higher-end ones, for example some of their GMTs, which take inspiration from the likes of Rolex and some really insane skeletonized tourbillons. They also made one of the cheapest micro-rotor watches you can get in the current day market, that being the 5000A, which exists in popular micro brands such as the Baltic MR01 and the Lobini micro-rotor. The Chinese movement manufacturer seems to stretch out their limbs more, creating their own complex movement designs whilst taking advantage of the techniques and complications developed by the Swiss and the Japanese to improve their own movements, which I highly respect. Now, enough history, let's get down to the specs of this caliber. The automatic caliber 7M01 features an 80 or 72 hour power reserve, sources vary, and also a higher beat rate of 28,800 beats per hour, with mine lasting about 3 days, which if you take into account that this is a watch that costs less than $200, it's quite a bit of watch for the money you pay. The 7M01 also hacks and hand winds as a bonus, which just neatly packages the 6mm thin 7M01 as one of the highest spec'd cheap movements out there, destroying the closely priced Miyota 9015 and Seagull ST2130, both in terms of power reserve. Besides the mind-boggling specifications, we must also not forget to talk about the finishing work that Borman did on the movement in this watch. The standard 7M01 has a pretty standard looking finishing, similar to the type of finishing you'd find on mid-tier Seagull movements, with what I call the signature Seagull Côte de China, the inconsistent perlage and the dirt residues that remain on the metal. However, it's very evident that Borman's watchmakers have taken it upon themselves to make the movement as aesthetically pleasing as they reasonably can in a $200 budget. Borman, with seemingly their specialty in engraving and dial making, gave the bridge plate of the 7M01 a circular Côte de Genève finishing, similar but slightly inferior to that on the in-house movements manufactured by Frédéric Constant. Despite this, the circular finishing gives off a proper circular shine, and on top of this, the same bridge plate features engravings of the specifications of the movement, specifying the beat rate, the jewel count, and 80 hours remontoire, which doesn't really make sense, seeing that a remontoire usually denotes a constant force escapement, which only exists in incredibly high-end watches. Along with the lettering on the bridge plate, there is also an engraving of a griffin, the same logo featured on the Hangzhou 5000A that is found on the Lobini micro-rotor. With that said, we have to talk about the massive looming elephant stuck behind the caseback, the rotor. The rotor on this movement is like nothing I have ever seen before at this price range. I mean, it clearly isn't the stock rotor that came with the 7M01. Instead, the rotor is made of what seems to be a lathe or CNC machine chunk of brass, brass being one of the easier materials to work with on a lathe, with me having done so in the past. The rotor on the Borman Moonphase features a really pretty guilloche styled cut, having the sort of rainbow on rainbow pattern that you see on the dials of some independent Swiss watchmakers. The pattern on the rotor plays with light like a really elegant disco ball, and it just makes the originally cheap looking movement look like something that you'll find in a watch from an independent luxury watchmaker. The rotor is also cut with a curve on each side, again giving me the impression that the people that made this budget masterpiece really had put in the thought to make it look as grand and haute horologerie as possible. Looking closer at the rotor, you start to see the telltale signs that this rotor was definitely machined instead of pressed, which is generally the lazy way of doing patterns like this on metal. The edges are way too sharp and clean for it not to be machined, and it's just crystal clear that there is no way this rotor is pressed out, which means that Borman genuinely put in quite a decent amount of effort to produce this watch, with my best guess being that they made the rotors in-house, having to swap them out with the original rotors after refinishing the watch, since I've yet to see another Hangzhou 7M01 with something similar. And adding on to the impressiveness of the rotor is the fact that it doesn't have any dust on it as far as I can tell, which is really surprising seeing that there are so many areas on the rotor in which dust particles can safely sleep on. Beyond that, the thick rotor being made of brass is really heavy, with the density of brass being slightly higher than that of 316L stainless steel. This does unfortunately result in the downside of having quite a noisy rotor, and also the ability to actually feel the rotor move as you sway your hands, which surprisingly is something that also exists on some Swiss luxury watches with really smoothly spinning rotors as well. And something else that is quite interesting with the 7M01 is that its self-winding module makes use of a similar design to Seiko's magic lever, with a downside of this making the movement feel slightly scratchy when it comes to hand winding, and this scratchiness on the 7M01 is amplified when the movement is fully wound. The movement also features a 31-day date wheel, which Borman has repurposed into the Moonphase. So yes, unfortunately the Moonphase on this watch isn't a true 28.5-day Moonphase like it should be, but hey, you win some, you lose some. Though if Borman is listening to what most of us have to say, please, make it a true Moonphase. And on this movement, the date changes nearly instantly, just like the date change on an Attitude 824, though sadly you don't really notice it since the date wheel is a giant round disc. Lastly, besides the amazing specifications of the Hangzhou 7M01, I am happy to say that mine runs at around plus or minus 4 seconds a day, which is just brilliant. The watch, with all of its outstanding specifications and menial downsides, seems to be well worth the price of $165. It seems to me that it's near impossible to get anything that comes close to the value of this watch at a similar price range. The Borman Moonphase destroys almost every similar watch. I feel the Borman just knocks it right out of the park, especially when you are someone like me who highly favors watchmaking and movement aesthetics when it comes to collecting. I also genuinely feel that Borman should continue towards this direction when they produce their next piece, seeing that many of their other pieces aren't particularly my cup of tea. Either way, I feel that this watch is a must buy if you are looking for an interesting dress piece. I feel that it captivates me just as well as my $400 Seiko Presage did, with the only difference being the fact that I was both stunned by the movement and the dial this time. But anyways, with all that said and done, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did like it, please leave a like and subscribe, and if you have any fun future video ideas or watches that you'd like me to review, please leave it in the comments, because quite frankly, I think I'm running out of ideas. But anyways, once again, thank you for watching and have a very nice day.